Today on Spectrum, we'll visit with an author who speaks of Maui as a hero rather than an island. We'll explore 3 different materials being used for sculpture in Hawaii today. Also, we'll discover the gracious manners of a courteous culture in Okinawan costume, music, and dance. On the windward side of Oahu lives an author who has been researching and writing many myths and tales of ancient Polynesia. These stories were once told in chants. The chants endured to the 20th century, where they have been recorded and translated by anthropologists. Their findings have informed the imagination of Stephen Goldsberry, who has composed a novel about the Demi-God Maui. Occasionally, there is a critical moment when an author realizes that he has found his story.
I've never had a choice. Something grabbed me. From the moment I saw that picture of Maui, from the moment I first began reading the stories, I was held.
With Goldsberry, it began when he noticed a peculiar painting of land and sky.
Represented the earth, and struggling between these 2 huge curves was a very tiny figure of a man lifting, and the title was Maui Lifts the Sky. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of Maui. So I began researching. I went to the library and I worked, read all the stories, and I thought this must be the great Polynesian tale. This must be the great story of the Hawaiian Islands.
Maui, the demigod, however, is a story shared by many islands.
Maui was pan-Pacific. We find tales of Maui from many of the island groups to the south. And when I was working with the book, I wanted the most dramatic tale. And I wanted to balance that tale with another tale that maybe wasn't a Maui tale, but was like a Maui tale. And so I pulled in a couple of trickster stories from Tahiti, for example, and incorporated them into the text and made them Maui stories. The tales became fiercely localized. There were storytellers and chanters who claimed that Maui lived on Kauai, that he lived on Maui, that he lived on the Big Island, that he lived in New Zealand.
An author's first novel usually requires more time to compose than is expected.
I was naive enough at the time to think that this would be easy. I've got the 7 great feats of Maui laid out, the basic plot outline. Now all I need to do is simply flesh out these tales. And it took me 8 years of research and writing to do that. What kept me going, I think, was my wife, in a lot of ways, who's part Hawaiian.
You never know how long a project's going to take. When it starts out, you think that it's going to be, you have everything planned out, and all the note cards are up, tacked on the wall, and everything is set. And when Stephen started building the shed, he said something that I've quoted often. And it was, when he first started building the shed, he said that it would only take 1 good weekend to finish the shed. A month and a half later, it was still being done. And that's sort of how the book went.
Well, the book is dedicated to my wife, and I thought about her a lot when I wrote it. I wondered what she would like, what she would dislike, what her reactions would be. I told her the stories as I wrote. I read to her. I handed her pages of the manuscript. She typed. She was a thoroughgoing partner on the project.
And I think the thing I learned most about working with an author on a project is that it's not like an 8-to-5 job where you can sit down, do the work, turn it off and leave the office. They need a lot of time to just sit and stare, and it's hard for me to, it was hard for me at the very beginning because I thought that when Stephen went into the shed, it was the writing process started and then it ended at a certain time, and then I could have dinner at 5:30 and everything would be regimented, and it's just not how it happens. Sometimes he'd have to take a break and go out and surf just to collect his thoughts. And it took me a long time to realize that the creative process involved that sort of recreation.
When he heard the eel plunge in, he kicked out the bottom stones and broke the dam. The water poured out, the current starting to pull Maui with it. But he clung to the stones inside the wall and held tight. In the black flux of water, he saw the eel's body being pulled through the opening. He thrust his dagger into the side of the eel as it passed, and he cut it open from gills to tail vent. You delight first, and then you instruct. After you entertain the reader, then you can teach him. And I hope that Maui is an example of that rule.
His work habits flourish best in undisturbed solitude. Goldsberry constructed this shed for such a purpose.
I like to go to the shed and close everything down and just be alone for a while.
It is here that Goldsberry has allowed moments of peace, a time when he might think deeply of Polynesian myth. He explains the story of Wakea and Papa, a Hawaiian myth that enhances Maui's fame, while offering a sensual answer to a universal mystery.
The sky was descending to make love to the earth. Wakea was bringing his awesome weight down onto the body of Papa, which is the earth. And all of the people who lived on the earth were scared when they could see the sky coming down. They realized that pretty soon they would be crushed between these two great bodies. And what Maui did was he went and climbed the highest mountain on the island, which was in this rendering Haleakala on Maui, on the island of Maui, and he pushed the sky god away from the earth goddess. The reason the heavens stay so far away from the earth now is because Wakea thinks that he's been forever rejected by Papa.
Maui himself, however, cherished a peculiar ambition.
He wanted to reach so much farther than anybody else had ever reached. He wanted to conquer death.
When a writer dares to penetrate into the insoluble questions, he discovers themes of magnitude.
The best books that I have read that have moved me most when I was reading them, that have changed me as I read them, are books of madness and books of death, because these are the great questions. These are the great wonderments that man entertains.
Deep questions invariably involve feelings. Sculptors bring their feelings to material, where they work out their sculpture with their hands. Have you ever noticed how certain types of sculpture seem inevitable? Sometimes there is a rightness about their placement. Elegant skin divers floating in a blue water sky. An aquatic suggestion from Sea Life Park. Or an owl sitting in judgment in front of the mirrors of illusion at Admiral Thomas Towers. Black copper assumes the smooth, hollow-air form of a sculptor's feelings. Can an artist's feelings be portrayed in solid material? Let's pick 3 materials being sculpted in Hawaii today and try to find out. There is stone, quarried, drawn raw from the earth, to return to earth in new ways. Copper, also from the earth, mined raw from deep beneath the surface, then made into a metal that is welcome in the sculptor's workshop. Finally, plastic, a synthetic creation of man that begins as a liquid which may slowly harden into the sculptor's wish. Each of these materials has its own challenge and demands, yet none of these materials were the artist's first choice. Michael Tom explains.
I tried various metals, but I've always found copper to be the one that, you know, really speaks. I mean, it has a beautiful color. You can, from browns to blues. I chose black because I like that the most. But, you know, it's malleable. It forgives when you hit it.
An artist is guided by his feelings. Chuck Watson began in metal, but found stone to be more intimate.
It's a much more satisfactory feeling to work in stone than it is to work in metal. It's hard to explain, but there's a warmth to stone. There's a feeling of closeness to it. It's a natural substance, where steel, of course, is a fabricated material. Stone is part of the world, part of what we live with, and part of what we are.
This soaring flock of birds emerged from a can of epoxy glue, together with various powders and fiberglass cloth. Experienced in clay, sculptor Ken Shutt sought a material with clay-like consistency, but higher strength and lighter weight.
The most successful material that I came upon was epoxy resin. I can't think of another material that this could be built in just this way. Other materials, to get strong enough, get much too heavy. I've chosen epoxy because it's very strong for its weight, and I can cantilever shapes out.
During the process of creation, a sculptor often works from a model, but not always. Michael Tom occasionally uses models, but not when his approach is intuitive.
To begin a project, I usually draw it out, or as far as the techniques, it's fairly intuitive.
Chuck Watson always works from a model. Stone is unforgiving, however. If a mistake is made, stone will not bend to accommodate it. Therefore, Watson proceeds with a determination to conquer the stone. If his model is an owl, then there is an owl inside the stone.
I can see the owl that I want to come out of that stone, and I'm going to make it come out of that stone.
Before Ken Shutt composes his epoxy plastic sculpture, he tries out ideas on various models. It is in the model where changes might be made. An alteration might suggest itself, an experiment encouraged. When the model is complete, this sculptor will then repeat it in larger scale.
So essentially every step that I go through in the model construction is repeated in the full size.
Ken Shutt's models contain styrofoam, which are then covered with an epoxy solution.
This is styrofoam with a fiberglass stiffener down the center.
He determines the positions of his dolphin sculpture by testing and playing with the models. He also makes many drawings and enjoys watching the natural movement of marine wildlife.
I used to spend a lot of time looking through the glass in the Whalers Cove at Sea Life Park, and the interplay of these animals. The individual shapes are interesting and they're certainly beautiful, but the way they move together and the way they'll be moving together, but their bodies will be in a variety of interplay, you might say. So this is the thing that interested me in developing these sculptures.
Now retired from the presidency of the Hawaiian Dredging and Construction Company, Chuck Watson wasn't always a sculptor, but his interest in art and solid three-dimensional objects began early.
And I was on my own since I was 15 years old, and I couldn't make it all the way through college during the Depression. And so I started working and in spare time, and I finally wound up working full-time in construction and had to give up the thing I wanted to do, which was art and architecture, mostly architecture. So I picked what I thought was the closest thing to architecture, was contracting, building. It finally dawned on me that sculpture was the complete thing. You not only designed, but you constructed, so you were the architect and the contractor.
Although commonly more at home with red Swedish granite and Botticino Italian marble, Watson also tries his hand at local stones, as he did for these craters of the moon.
This is a local basalt. It's a local Hawaiian rock. As a matter of fact, it came from Kapa'a Quarry, right over here. This is the rock that they crush and make the concrete that makes the buildings of Hawaii.
The Halekulani Hotel had a challenging commission for Watson. They wanted a Hawaiian symbol, but a very unique one.
I spent about 4 months at the Bishop Museum and looking through all the books that I could find on Hawaiiana before a design really came to me that could be stylized and could be very modern and very clean and very beautiful and still be very Hawaiian.
Michael Tom's sculpture occasionally appears as if an event just occurred, or almost like creatures waiting patiently. He began as a painter, then he discovered jewelry.
Jewelry was fascinating. It was a time in America where all the avant-garde jewelry came out. Things you never see at Liberty House or anything. I mean, body ornaments. And that was fascinating. And from there, I started working bigger.
Tom enjoys the three-dimensional medium of metal smithing. Larger pieces require more hammerwork, but there is pleasure in that.
The most pleasurable process of this metal smithing, I think, is the raising. It's the only part you see the metal really move, and you change the shape of the metal. And that I like. I enjoy that process.
The process of epoxy resin sculpture requires hours of drying. Ken Shutt's large cantilever designs are made possible by clamps and high pressure applied at critical contact points. Support rods may be removed after the glue is set.
Now I have the connection reinforced with fiberglass, and it's up to full strength.
Polyester resin is a popular material for surfboards and boat construction, but it dries too quickly to be worked by a sculptor, unlike epoxy resin, which Ken Shutt used for this private commission in a Portland, Oregon home.
The epoxy resin dries at a very slow rate, so there's a stage where it becomes kind of leather hard, where it's not so sticky, that you can move it around like clay. And this was the thing that drew me to the epoxy.
Sculpture requires painstaking skills and prodigious patience. But a sculptor uses his solid material to express his feelings. It is worth all the time and patience if the finished piece leaves an impression. Michael Tom might speak for many sculptors when he says,
I think all my work deals with feelings. I mean, no matter if it's hard edge or soft edge, it has to have that human feeling in it. That's why I like hammering. I mean, it leaves its mark on metal and sings, a person did it.
Leaving a man-made mark is brightly evident in Okinawan textiles. Traditional costumes combine with music and dance to reveal the ancient legacy of Okinawan culture here in Hawaii. Dance and music instructor Bonnie Miyashiro and Okinawan historian Dr. Sakihara join Spectrum for a look at the customs of Japan's southernmost people.
The Okinawan people are a very happy people that they bring out themselves, all of their emotions into their dances. And most of them are the happy dances and denoting love, and like the Americans.
Women wear very colorful kimono, and that design and color are very different from Japanese. Japanese tend to use subdued colors. Okinawans tend to use very bright colors. They say that it is influenced by the South Seas culture, Malaya or Indonesia.
It seems as though Okinawans have always been lovers of music. Classical court dances were reserved for men. Women were not allowed to perform, just as in the no or the kabuki. After World War II, then it became more acceptable for women to perform.
Classical music was more or less created during the early 18th century to feel the need to entertain the Chinese ambassadors. Classical music for the court and were done, performed by the gentry, members of gentry class. In that sense, it is a little different from Japan, where the musicians and performers, dancers, were looked down upon. And they were, of course, were not much better than the prostitutes during the Edo period. Today, of course, they're way up there, but then during the Edo period, they were no more than very much like untouchables. But in Okinawa, because of the need to entertain Chinese ambassadors, they were rigorously trained. There were government officials and members of gentry, young people, and so they enhanced the class. They were respected. Okinawan people are the best representative of the southern strain of Japanese people. Okinawa represents Japan's connection, Japan's link with Melanesia. In that sense, we do have something in common with Hawaii, because Hawaiian people are Polynesians who originally came from Melanesia, Southeast Asia, and Japanese people, of which Okinawans are part, did originated in Southeast Asia, Melanesia, a long time ago, maybe several thousand years ago. Sometimes people do say to me that I've been to Java and I listen to their music. It sounds very much like Okinawan music. Perhaps because Okinawa is politically marginal to Japan, that we are very conscious of our own position in the Japanese culture. Okinawa is about 1/7 the size of Hawaii. Population is in fact about 7 times as much as Hawaii. Japan, we usually say that it's a homogeneous country. All Japan, all we understand each other. But Okinawa is an exception. Sometimes in its history, Okinawa was part of Japan, sometimes it was not. I will say that throughout its history, whenever there was strong central government in Japan, when there was no central power in Japan, so political power disintegrates, then Okinawa is sure to be independent. Very recently, that happened in 1945, when Japan lost the war, Americans took over Okinawa, right? When the Japan became stronger again in 1972, Okinawa went back to Japan. That process has been repeated over and over again throughout the history. Okinawa is economically most backward prefecture in all Japan, and yet culturally, because of its ties with China and other areas outside Japan, Okinawa's culture is very rich. If we compare Okinawa to other prefectures about same size, we do have many, many more books and many people studying about Okinawan culture and history than any others. One thing that you notice about Okinawan culture is the predominant influence of Chinese culture on Okinawa. Here you have a picture of King of Okinawa dressed in his official costume, which is Chinese. He wears the crown, which was bestowed on him by the Chinese emperor. For about 5 centuries, Okinawa was a tributary state to China because China, court of China, court of Peking, was the center of the universe at the time. Okinawa, it was used to be on Japan's route to China. In the ancient times, anything new, important to Japan always came from the west and the south. West from China and south from Portuguese. As a gateway of Japan towards south and west. For that reason, it is unique in the history of Japan, quite different from others. In the pre-modern days, in the Ryukyu Kingdom days, the top honor, the ambition of man or anyone was to obtain government posts, become official. But then to become official, you had to pass civil service exam, which is very difficult. So you had to start 10 years, 15 years when you're young. So all these times of study, who would support you? Your wife. It was quite popular for the women of Naha that you are not worthy of your name of women of Naha if you cannot support one or two men. After I came to Hawaii, I also see the women of Okinawa women in the community here. Also, the women, they work very hard. Okinawa men are afraid of the women. Women are like tigers.